Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're really diving deep into something that I think is going to hit home for a lot of you. We're talking about parental alcoholism, and specifically, how it impacts daughters.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that, has a lot of layers to it, but we're here to, hopefully unpack some of that and shed some light on it.
For sure. And, we want to be sensitive about it, but also like really honest about some of the research we found, because it was really interesting to see how daughters specifically are affected by this in ways that you might not expect.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
a lot of times when we talk about alcoholism and addiction, we talk about the genetic component, right?
Yeah.
Or the environmental component. But there's actually a lot of research that points to daughters of alcoholic parents, particularly mothers, having a higher risk of certain mental health challenges compared to sons.
Okay, so that's interesting. Like, I feel like going into this, you would just think, oh, an alcoholic parent, that's going to be rough no matter what. But to think that it actually impacts daughters differently than sons, why is that?
Well, again, it's complicated, right? There are a lot of factors that could play into this, but some research suggests, societal expectations might be a big one. Think about it. Women are often like raised to be caretakers, right? To prioritize everyone else's needs, even if it means like sacrificing their own well-being.
Totally. Like, it's almost like that ingrained thing of like women are the emotional center and they have to kind of hold everything together.
Exactly, exactly. And so when you put that in the context of, growing up with an alcoholic parent, it's not surprising that daughters might feel this immense pressure to like fix the situation, which, obviously that's not on them, but it can be really damaging in the long run.
Yeah, it's almost like they end up taking on the responsibility of the problem, even though it's not theirs to carry.
Hmm.
And this is making me think too, could this also be tied to just like different coping mechanisms between, men and women, boys and girls? Like, do daughters maybe internalize this stress more, whereas sons might externalize it?
That's a great point, and it's definitely something that researchers are looking into more and more because it really highlights how important it is to have support systems and resources that are, tailored to these unique challenges, right? Because
Mm.
it's not just about the addiction itself. It's like you're saying, it's the societal stuff, the familial roles, all of that gets tangled up in it.
Yeah, so it's not even just like the daughter might develop AUD, alcohol use disorder, which in itself is a really big deal.
Yeah.
But we're also talking about like the ripple effects,
Right.
like how this impacts mental health more broadly.
100%, yeah. And this is actually a good segue into some of the, maybe less talked about, but equally significant impacts. The research really dives into things like trust issues, fear of abandonment, even like difficulty forming healthy romantic relationships later in life.
Yep. Okay, see, and this is where it starts to get really interesting for me and honestly a little heavy because now we're not just talking about like, clinical diagnoses. We're talking about how this experience can really shape a woman's entire like worldview,
Yeah.
her relationships, her sense of self. So if any of this is resonating with you so far, definitely stick with us. We're going to unpack these emotional impacts even more right after this. And we're back. And, it's easy to get caught up in some of those, like, I don't know, more immediate impacts of alcoholism, like the health risks or, whether it can be passed down. But this next part of the research really dives into the emotional side. And to be honest, even for me, it was kind of eye-opening.
Yeah, and when you really stop and think about it, it makes sense. You've got a daughter, right? She's growing up, she's got an alcoholic parent, maybe it's her mom. And often what happens is she kind of gets thrust into this role reversal thing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like she becomes the responsible one, right? The emotional caretaker. And a lot of times this is happening at an age where she still needs that for herself.
Totally. It's like their own childhood gets put on hold. And the research really, like, digs into this and
Huh?
talks about how this can show up later as trust issues, fear of abandonment.
Yeah.
It's almost like a logical conclusion if you think about it. If the person who's supposed to be your safe haven is completely unpredictable or emotionally unavailable, that's going to mess you up.
100%, yeah. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, and it's something that I hear a lot about, in my work with clients. These patterns, they often get replayed like in their adult relationships. Daughters of alcoholics might find themselves drawn to partners who maybe even subconsciously, remind them of that parent.
It's like they're trying to rewrite the story,
Yeah.
to try to get that happy ending they didn't have the first time around.
Yeah, exactly. Like this urge to fix or save them, just like they might have tried to do with their parent.
Wow. If you're listening to this right now, That's resonating with some people. Like, have you noticed that in your own life?
Hmm.
Because it's crazy to think about how these early experiences can have these, like, invisible fingerprints on us that shape our choices in ways that we don't even realize.
It's true. And it's not about, I want to be clear here. It's not about blaming yourself for that. It's about recognizing it
Right.
and understanding it so that you can start to heal from it, which kind of brings us to another big thing that the research talked about, this idea of like, it's not about blame, but it can feel that way.
That is such an important distinction. I'm so glad you brought that up because the research found that it is so common for daughters of alcoholics to carry around all this guilt and shame as if somehow they were the cause of their parents' addiction.
And we have to be very clear here. Addiction, it's a disease. It's not a choice. Children are never to blame for a parent's alcoholism, like full stop. But I know, like intellectually knowing that and truly believing it and like emotionally processing it, those are two very different things.
Oh, absolutely, especially as a kid, right? Like when you're living in that and you're trying to make sense of all this chaotic, often really painful stuff, you're going to try to find an explanation, right? And sometimes the easiest one, even if it's not accurate, is to blame yourself. So, okay, for those listening who are like, oh my gosh, that's me, I feel that. Where do you even begin to like untangle that guilt and shame?
Yeah.
Because it sounds like it gets in there deep.
Yeah, it really can. And that's honestly where therapy can be like so valuable. Approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT can be super effective.
So for those who are like, okay, CBT, I've heard that. I don't really know what that means. Can you break that down a little?
Sure, yeah. So basically, CBT, it helps you to understand how you know your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors, how they're all kind of interconnected, right? And it gives you tools to change those patterns. So in this case, it might involve like identifying those, it was my fault thoughts and like reframing them into something like my parent had a disease and as a child I was doing the best that I could in a really tough situation.
Reframing, rewriting the narrative. That's so powerful.
It is, and it sounds, when you say it like that, it sounds simple, but honestly, that shift can be incredibly powerful because it lets you step out of that self-blame cycle and start focusing on like your own healing, your own well-being.
Yes, love that. And speaking of support, the research didn't just leave us hanging with all this heavy stuff. It actually highlights some amazing resources out there, organizations that are specifically designed to support people who grew up with alcoholic parents. Because the reality is, you are not alone. And you don't have to go through this alone. There's help, there's hope, and there's like a whole community of people out there who get it, who understand exactly what you're going through. We're going to dive into those resources more after a quick break. Okay, so let's talk about some of those resources because I know it can be like, you get to this point and it's like, okay, where do I even begin? Trying to navigate all this on your own just feels really overwhelming.
Yeah, totally overwhelming. But, the good news is you don't have to. Like, there are some really amazing organizations that are out there specifically designed to support people in this exact situation, people who grew up with alcoholic parents. And the good news is you don't have to have it all figured out. There are options, and we can help you figure out what might be the best fit for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So like, let's start unpacking some of those. We briefly mentioned Al-Anon. We mentioned Adult Children of Alcoholics. Can you tell us a little more about what each of those offers?
Yeah, definitely. So Al-Anon is a great resource if you are dealing with the impact of someone else's drinking in your life. That could be a parent who's actively still struggling, or even if they're, they've passed away, but those emotional patterns are still really affecting you. And it's really about, supporting yourself through that, whatever that looks like.
Got it. So it's less about like trying to get your parent into treatment and more about, okay, how do I navigate my own journey with this?
Exactly. Adult Children of Alcoholics, ACA, is specifically for adults who grew up with an alcoholic parent. And it really focuses on those like long-term effects, right? Those thought patterns, the relationship dynamics, all the stuff that we've been talking about. It's about like really unpacking that legacy and, hopefully breaking those cycles, learning to set healthy boundaries for yourself, all of that.
So for someone who's listening, who's like, you know what? My parent, they got sober years ago, but I'm just now realizing how much that's still like playing out in my life. ACA could be a good fit for them.
Absolutely. It's never too late, right? Like you said, it could be years, it could be decades even, but it's never too late to start unpacking those experiences and healing from them. And, it's worth mentioning too, there are also like, groups specifically for teenagers, right? Because dealing with this as a teenager, oh my gosh, so tough. And having a space where they can process those feelings with other teens who get it can be so powerful.
I can only imagine because just being a teenager is hard enough. right?
Yeah.
Without having the added, I don't know, stress and confusion of like your parents struggling with addiction. Do you have any recommendations for resources specifically for teens?
Yeah, definitely. Alateen is a great one. It's a peer-led support group, which I think is really cool because it allows, the teens to connect with other teens who truly get it, right? Because,
Right.
that feeling of like nobody understands, nobody gets it, that's already so common in adolescence. But then you add this on top of it, and with Alateen, they can find a whole community of people who are like, actually, we get it.
Yeah. There's something so powerful about just knowing you're not alone,
Yeah.
you know? And listening to all of this, I think what really strikes me is how much strength it takes to even just like acknowledge this stuff, to say,
Hmm.
this thing happened to me, it had an impact and I need support.
Yeah. It's a huge step, and I don't think that gets acknowledged enough, honestly. Like, it takes courage to face these wounds, and it takes even more courage to be like, I want to heal from this. I want to move forward.
100%. And on that note, I think this research leaves us with a really interesting question, something to kind of carry with you as you move forward. It talks about how, daughters of alcoholics often end up taking on this like adult role in their families. And so my question to you listening is, how might that be showing up in your life now, even in subtle ways? Like, are there ways that you can kind of reclaim that part of your childhood that you maybe missed out on? Rediscovering some of that joy, that freedom. I think it's a question worth sitting with. Maybe even journaling about as you continue on your own deep dive with all of this. And just remember, you don't have to do it alone. There are resources, there is support, and there is hope for a brighter, healthier future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.